The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, steady and merciless, casting the ICU in that particular shade of institutional white that made 6 a.m. feel like midnight. Brooke Sullivan moved through St. Michael's with a kind of practiced invisibility that only comes from years of making yourself smaller than the space you occupy. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable. Her badge hung at an angle that kept her face slightly obscured in the ID photo. The smell of antiseptic and cooling coffee hung in the corridors like a permanent resident, and she breathed it in the way soldiers breathe in air, without comment, without waste. The morning shift briefing had already started when she clocked in at the nurse's station, her movements economical and precise. Dr. Whitfield stood at the center of the huddle like a conductor positioning himself before an orchestra, his white coat crisp enough to cut glass, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders like a medal he'd awarded to himself. Brooke slipped into the periphery, opening the chart for room for 12, her fingers moving across the tablet with the kind of muscle memory that suggested she'd done this 10,000 times before. Because she had. Sullivan. Whitfield's voice arrived before she'd finished scrolling. Not a greeting. A summons. You're taking the new admission. Trauma Bay. The weight of those words settled different than it should have. Around her, she felt the other nurses exchange glances, the kind that communicated without speaking. The new admission had come in 2 hours ago, still in the trauma bay because nobody had wanted the assignment. A paralyzed Special Forces veteran from Tikrit. 38 years old. T for spinal cord injury. Prognosis, static. The kind of case that made administrators nervous because it wouldn't generate the kind of recovery statistics that looked good in board presentations. Of course, Brooke said, her voice level and compliant. The inflection of someone who has learned that obedience is invisible armor. Whitfield's smile arrived slowly, the kind that suggested he'd been waiting for her to confirm what he already knew, that she would take what no one else wanted. Good. Let's see how long you last with this one, He turned to the 2 residents flanking him like remora fish. Gentlemen, I'll wager $50 the master ringer here calls it quits within 7 days. Who's interested? The residents laughed, predictable and eager. Brooke didn't look up from the tablet. Her jaw clenched once, a single, controlled movement that no one watching her would have caught unless they'd been trained to see such things. Her hands remained steady as she pulled up the full file for Captain Marcus Hale, reading the clinical narrative that someone else had written, documenting the day that this man's body had stopped answering commands. I'll take that bet, one of the residents said. So will I, said the other. Whitfield's expression widened into something that resembled satisfaction. He walked past her station without another word, his shoes clicking against the linoleum with the precision of someone who believed the sound of his movement was important. Brooke waited until he'd rounded the corner toward the elevators, then she stood, pulling the file and moving toward the trauma bay with the same unhurried pace she used for everything else. Urgency, she had learned long ago, was a luxury that betrayed you. The trauma bay at St. Michael's was a room designed for controlled chaos, all stainless steel surfaces and ventilators that wheezed their mechanical rhythm, all the equipment mounted and organized with the efficiency of a ship's engine room. Captain Marcus Hale lay in the center of it, his body arranged in the careful geometry that paralysis demands, straight legs, arms positioned to prevent contracture, his head turned slightly toward the window where weak morning light tried to penetrate the hospital glass. He was conscious. That was the first thing she noted. His eyes tracked toward her as she entered, and there was an intelligence there that the clinical narrative hadn't fully captured. The chart described his injury but not his presence, the way a man without the ability to move could still occupy the space around him, could still press his consciousness outward like a hand against a window. Captain Hale, Brooke said, approaching the left side of the bed. I'm Brooke. I'll be your nurse today. All day. His voice was careful, rationed, the way people speak when their diaphragm isn't functioning at capacity. A ventilator sat nearby, ready but not yet engaged. He was breathing on his own, which meant he had that much agency at least. That's the assignment, she said. She began the routine checks with a kind of fluid efficiency that suggested no waste, no conversation that wasn't necessary. Vitals. The monitor showed his sinus rhythm steady at 68 beats per minute. Blood pressure holding at 118/74. O2 sat 96 on room air. She logged it, noting the consistency, the stability. A man whose body had stopped moving but whose heart was still trying to do its job with discipline. They all quit, Marcus said. Not a question. An observation. The nurses before you. Brooke looked up from the monitor. His eyes were tracking hers now with the intensity of someone who couldn't afford to miss subtle shifts in expression, someone for whom the face of the person in front of him was the only data point that mattered. I don't quit, she said. The words arrived without planning, without the careful management that usually governed her speech. For a moment she heard how they might sound to him, not reassurance but something harder than that. A statement. A fact. She moved back to the task log, pulling his medication schedule up on the tablet, and when she looked at him again, something had shifted in his expression. Not quite hope. More like recognition. The morning passed with the rhythm that hospital work maintains, the 1,000 small interventions that keep a body from deteriorating, the checks and adjustments and documentation that constitute care for someone whose main trajectory is towards stillness. Brooke moved through it without the kind of chattiness that other nurses used to fill space, but her hands were never still, never uncertain. She knew where the 18-gauge needle should go for his line. She knew how to turn him without creating pressure points. She knew the exact pressure to use when she was handling his legs, because pain was information, and information was the only thing that separated competence from negligence. By noon, Whitfield had circled past the trauma bay 3 times. Each time, he'd stopped at the threshold without entering, his expression sharpening as he watched her work. On the 3rd pass, she heard him speaking to someone in the corridor, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he wanted to be overheard. She's good with her hands, I'll give her that. But it's not about skill with these types of cases. It's about sustainability. The emotional labor gets to them. 7 days maximum, and we'll have the bed back for someone we can actually help. Brooke didn't pause in her work. She was repositioning Marcus's right arm, checking for any early signs of spasticity, and her focus remained there, on the clinical task, on the body in front of her. But something in her peripheral vision had shifted. A memory, perhaps, or the shadow of one. Tikrit. 20 years ago. The smell of burning fuel and dust and something else, something that smelled like copper and mortality. She was carrying a 6-year-old through rubble-scattered streets, the boy's blood warm against her uniform, his small weight managed with the kind of practiced care that comes only from doing this before, from learning how to move through fire with a child in your arms. The mortar rounds were landing 2 blocks away, then 1 block, the percussion of each impact arriving through her boots, through the ground itself. She ran because running was the only medicine available, and the kid's grip around her neck was the only measure of whether she was moving fast enough. The hospital bay came back into focus. Brooke's hands were steady. Marcus was watching her, and she realized he'd been watching her for some time, watching the way her eyes had momentarily gone somewhere else, somewhere hot and loud. You were there, he said. Not a question. She didn't respond. Instead, she checked his purport, adjusted his blanket, and made the notation in his chart, stable. Vitals within normal range. Patient alert and oriented. No acute distress. But when she left the trauma bay that afternoon, when she passed the break room and saw the combat boots she'd left at the bottom of her locker, their leather worn and creased from 1,000 miles of walking through territories that didn't appear on most maps, something in her chest tightened. The boots were there because she'd never been able to throw them away. Because they were the only thing she'd kept from a life she'd been ordered to forget, from an identity that was supposed to have vanished entirely into the classified files that the Pentagon maintained in rooms that didn't officially exist. She closed the locker without opening it. Whitfield was still watching. Always watching. And tomorrow, she knew, the real test would begin. Morning rounds at St. Michael's began at 6:51. Whitfield arrived first, his pressed coat holding a crease sharp enough to draw blood, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light as he gestured to the assembled residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. Brooke stood at the medication cart outside Marcus's room, checking the 4 drip rates on the digital monitors. She didn't look up when she heard his voice. The Paralyzed Special Forces case in Bay 7. Whitfield's tone carried the lilt of someone about to deliver a punchline. Our dedicated nurse here has convinced herself this is salvageable. Admirable, really. Quixotic. The kind of thinking that loses us money and beds for actual patients. He paused, knowing the residents were watching Brooke's reaction. I've made a small wager with Dr. Harrison and Dr. Chen. 7 days. That's how long our Florence Nightingale lasts before reality sets in and she quits. The two residents exchanged glances. One smiled. Neither spoke. Brooke continued checking the flow rate. Her fingers were absolutely steady on the tubing. The monitor beeped its rhythm, 72 beats per minute, regular and clean. She could feel their eyes on her back, waiting for something, a flinch, a retort, some visible crack in her composure. The silence stretched. She simply turned to the next bag of normal saline and adjusted the drip. Nothing to say. Whitfield's voice had an edge now, the tone of a man unaccustomed to being ignored. No passionate speech about the sanctity of life. Brooke turned. Her eyes met his for exactly 2 seconds. Then she returned to her work. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He'd expected tears or anger or some kind of emotional performance. Instead, he'd gotten nothing. He walked away, muttering something about professionalism to the residents who hurried after him, and Brooke was alone in the corridor with only the sound of ventilators humming from the patient rooms. She had 4 hours until lunch. The cafeteria at St. Michael's occupied the basement level, its fluorescent panels casting a clinical glare across rows of industrial tables. Brooke carried her tray, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, black coffee, and chose a table near the service window. She sat alone. This was her routine, unbroken for 8 months. No conversation. No eye contact. Just fuel. Whitfield entered at 12:34, flanked by 2 attending physicians and a pharmaceutical rep in a navy suit. He was mid-sentence, gesturing with the confidence of someone who controlled every room he entered. His leather shoe, Italian, probably $2,000, caught the edge of her tray. The collision wasn't accidental. Eggs scattered across the linoleum in a yellow arc, toast scattered. The coffee cup shattered against the tile, sending black liquid spreading in fractal patterns. For a moment nobody moved. The cafeteria had gone very quiet. Whitfield smiled. Then he pressed the sole of his shoe directly into the eggs, grinding them into the floor with methodical pressure, watching her the entire time. His smile never wavered. The pharmaceutical rep looked away. One of the attendings cleared his throat. Brooke set down her coffee, the unbroken cup still in her hand, and stood. She walked to the service window, collected a mop and bucket without speaking to anyone, and returned to clean the floor. The bucket water hissed from the faucet. The mop strokes were precise, efficient, completely unhurried. She worked around Whitfield's shoes as he stood there, clearly expecting some reaction. When none came, he left. She finished mopping. Then she sat at another table with nothing in front of her and waited out the remainder of her lunch break, staring at nothing. The chart incident happened at 3 in the afternoon. Brooke was walking Marcus's medication list down the hallway when Whitfield emerged from the physician's lounge, Marcus's medical file in his hands. He was alone this time. Perhaps that made it worse. He threw the folder at her feet, not handed it, threw it, and the paper spilled across the tile in a scattered fan. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was smooth as oil. "Some of us have actual patients to save." He walked past her without waiting for a response. Brooke knelt. She gathered each page methodically, checking the order, tapping them against the tile to align them perfectly. The derogatory nickname, sweetheart, had been chosen deliberately. It wasn't an insult. It was a diminishment. An infantilization. The kind of word used to reduce someone to something small enough to dismiss entirely. She could feel the weight of his contempt like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. When she stood, the folder was in perfect order. Her hands were perfectly steady. There was nothing in her expression that would give him satisfaction, because she had already decided he would not get that from her. Not ever. Not once. She returned to Marcus's room. He was sleeping, his paralyzed body arranged carefully on the hospital bed, the ventilator inflating his lungs with its mechanical rhythm. Brooke checked his lines, the central venous catheter, the arterial pressure monitor, the Foley catheter, and documented everything in the electronic chart with precise movements. Normal saline running at 15 milliliters per hour. No fever. No signs of infection. His pupils equal and reactive. Everything clean. Everything exact. At 8:43 that evening, after the day shift ended and the night crew took over, Brooke went to her locker in the staff break room. She opened it. The other nurses were changing out of their scrubs, talking about their kids and their marriages and their weekend plans. Nobody noticed her reach into the back corner and pull out the boots. Combat boots. 20 years old. Still broken in perfectly to the shape of her feet. The laces were frayed. The right sole had separated at the heel. The leather was scarred and creased from 1,000 miles of walking through places that no longer existed officially, through operations that had never happened, carrying people who were never supposed to be saved. She stood in the supply closet, the one nobody used, the one with the extra 4 bags and the bulk sterile gauze, and stared at those boots for a long time. Just stared at them. Her jaw clenched once, hard, as if she were biting down on something she needed to break. This was day 1. There were 6 more to go. She put the boots back in her locker. She locked the door. Then she went back to the ICU to check on Marcus at 9:13 in the evening, because whatever Whitfield had planned for the rest of the week, whatever bet he'd made, whatever humiliation was still coming, none of it mattered compared to the 12-year-old paralyzed veteran in Bay 7 who had no one else. At 9:47, the emergency line rang. The intercom crackled. Mass casualty. ETA 14 minutes. Military transport. Multiple GSWs and blast trauma. All available personnel to triage. The night shift froze. Brooke was already moving. Day 5 at St. Michael started like all the others. Brooke arrived at 0600 hours, pulled her scrubs from her locker, the combat boot still hidden beneath a folded towel, and made her way to Marcus's room. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Oxygen saturation 94%. Heart rate 72. Blood pressure stable. Everything looked like the slow climb toward recovery that nobody had expected. By noon, something shifted. Sats dropping, the day nurse mentioned casually, glancing at the monitor. 92. 90. 88. She didn't sound worried. Oxygen fluctuations happened. Most patients drifted. Marcus had been drifting since he arrived, paralyzed from the waist down, stable, alive because of luck and nothing else. The medical consensus had been written in sighs and averted eyes. Expected outcome, transfer to a long-term facility. Nobody said the other word out loud anymore. Brooke heard the shift in tone before she consciously registered the numbers. A nurse's ear gets trained to hear the difference between routine and wrong. The hiss of air escaping from pressure changes. The ventilator's mechanical wheeze turning strained. She was moving before the alarm sounded. The monitor climbed higher in pitch. 85. 82. 79. His pressure's bottoming out, the day nurse called, fingers fumbling with the 4 pump. Something's happening. Something's. The alarms erupted at once. 3 different monitors shrieking in unison. The code blue notification crackled over the intercom, cardiac decompensation, room for 12, all available personnel. The words came through in the clipped, practiced cadence of a hospital that had heard them 10,000 times before. Brooke had her hand on Marcus's chest before anyone else turned toward the door. She didn't have to look at the monitor to know what she was feeling, the pressure there, the subtle fullness beneath her palm that shouldn't exist. Fluid. Accumulating. Crushing. The clinical term was pericardial effusion. The practical term was a death sentence with a ticking clock. His heart was being strangled inside its own membrane. Dr. Whitfield swept into the room 2 minutes behind the code call, his coat pristine, his expression already calculating. He took one look at the monitor and started shouting orders with the confidence of a man who had never once been wrong about a patient's outcome. Get me a crash cart. 2 liters of normal saline running wide open. We need a portable chest film, stat. Call for a stat echocardiogram from cardiology. The resident froze. A fresh third year whose name Brooke had never bothered to learn. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching the monitor's descent, his mouth slightly open. 76. 72. 68. Doctor, he whispered. His output. I know what his output is, Whitfield snapped. Move. The resident didn't move. He stared at Marcus as if watching a man drown in front of him for the first time, realizing that knowing the physiology and living it were 2 different species of knowledge entirely. His hands trembled. His breathing quickened to match the alarm's accelerating rhythm. Brooke had already turned away from Marcus and moved to the supply cabinet. 14-gauge needle. Betadine. Sterile field. She pulled them in the order of prayer, each motion economical and precise. Not rushed. Not panicked. The movements belonged to hands that had done this in the dark under fire, hands that understood pain as information, pain as data. Muscle memory took over. Brooke, we need to stabilize him first, Whitfield called, not looking at her, already dismissing her presence as irrelevant. Get me the portable unit. The echo. She was already approaching Marcus's bedside with a needle in her hand. 64. 61. The blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well. His eyes were still conscious, still aware, that terrible alertness that came when the body died in increments and the mind stayed awake to witness it. Subclavian approach, Brooke said quietly. Not a question. Not a request. A command. Whitfield's head snapped toward her. What are you doing? What you're not. She didn't look at him. Her hands moved, prepping the skin, locating the landmark by feel, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy lived in her muscle. This was the procedure you performed when minutes were currency and seconds were already being spent on unnecessary steps. Portable machines, echo machines, consultations, all of it was shopping while the store was burning down. That's not protocol, Whitfield said, but there was something new in his voice. Something that wasn't quite authority anymore. Something like watching. The needle went in clean. One smooth motion. She felt the small pop of resistance as it entered the pericardium, and then the sudden give as she punctured through. The catheter slid in and fluid rushed out, dark, straw-colored fluid, weeks of accumulation, pressure that had been slowly strangling the strongest organ in his body. The monitor changed. 61 climbed to 65. 70. 76. 82. 88. 92. Stable. His heart rate steadied. The alarm softened to a satisfied beep beep beep. Marcus's eyes cleared like clouds breaking, the fog lifting. He gasped in a breath that actually filled his lungs. The resident was staring at her hands. At the needle. At the fluid now draining into a collection bag. At the monitor's resurrection. Whitfield stood absolutely still for exactly 3 seconds. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a quality of precision that meant danger. You performed a surgical procedure. As a nurse. I performed an emergency decompression, Brooke said, her voice dropped lower than it had been during the crisis. Steady. Flat. The accent of command language that soldiers recognized. She didn't turn toward him. She kept her hands on the catheter, keeping it secure. He was in cardiac tamponade. He had 2 minutes of perfusion pressure left. Maybe less. That's not your scope of practice. Neither is dying, she replied. And he was doing one of those things. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent light's electronic hum, the ventilator's steady rhythm, the soft sound of Marcus's breathing as he pulled air in, again and again, alive because a nurse with hands like surgical lasers had moved faster than protocol. Whitfield's jaw tightened. She saw the calculation flickering across his face. The recognition of something he hadn't expected. Not her competence, he'd already seen that over 4 days of impossible recoveries. But this? The ease. The absolute absence of doubt. The way she'd moved like she'd done this exact procedure under conditions far worse than an ICU at noon on a Thursday. He turned and left the room without another word. But Brooke knew him well enough by then to understand that his silence wasn't acceptance. His silence was the beginning of strategy. Dr. Whitfield's face drained the moment the monitor showed sinus rhythm. Not relief. Rage. His eyes went from the screen to Brooke, standing motionless beside Marcus's bed, needle still poised, her breathing controlled as a metronome, and something shifted in his expression. The calculation behind his eyes. The understanding that she had just done the impossible, and worse, that she had done it in front of 17 witnesses. He turned without a word and walked out of the trauma bay. The next 4 hours were the quiet before the door closes on your life. Brooke knew the feeling. She'd felt it once before, in a desert compound at 0400 hours, when a satellite phone rang and a voice told her to disappear. Now she sat in the break room with her hands wrapped around cooling coffee, watching the clock move through shifts she would no longer work. Nobody made eye contact. The hospital's internal messaging system had already begun its whisper. A nurse who'd violated protocol, exceeded her scope, performed a surgical procedure that would have earned her a malpractice suit if the patient hadn't survived. If. The word that changed everything. But Marcus had survived. The echo of his heartbeat still hung in the air like evidence. At 1847 hours, Brooke's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, report to administrator's office. Now. Not a request. A command. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, knowing what was waiting. Whitfield sat across from 2 administrators she'd never seen before, a woman with reading glasses and a man whose tie cost more than Brooke's monthly rent. Between them lay a file that seemed to contain her entire false life, already unraveling. Whitfield didn't wait for her to sit. You performed a surgical procedure. A pericardiocentesis. You are a registered nurse, not a trauma surgeon. You violated Hospital Protocol 47C, which explicitly prohibits nursing staff from performing invasive procedures beyond their certification. His voice was controlled, surgical itself. Additionally, I've contacted the board president, Dr. Harmon, regarding your credentials. The woman with reading glasses slid a document across the table. We've been reviewing your background. Your references from Houston Methodist, we reached out this afternoon. Nobody remembers you working there. Your supervisor from 2019, according to their HR department, never existed. The address on your employment application doesn't match any registered residence. Brooke's breath stayed level. Her hands rested on the table. The composure held. There are gaps, the man in the tie said, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Significant gaps. We're launching a formal investigation into your credentials and whether your educational background is legitimate. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending review. You will surrender your badge and access credentials. Whitfield watched her. Waiting for trembling. For tears. For the collapse he'd predicted a week ago when he made his bet with the residents. His phone was already in his hand, probably already drafting the email to the board that would confirm her termination before the investigation even concluded. Brooke stood. Removed her badge. Placed it on the table with the precision of someone placing a loaded weapon on neutral ground. The laminate caught the fluorescent light. Beneath her photo was a name that wasn't hers. I understand, she said. 8 words. No inflection. No apology. She walked out of the office and down to the locker room on the basement level, where the smell of antiseptic couldn't reach and the fluorescent lights hummed their endless complaint. Her locker was still warm from the morning, her shift untouched. She opened it and began the ritual of undressing from a life that was already being erased. Scrubs into a duffel bag. Compression socks. The stethoscope that had belonged to someone else, once. And then her hand found the bottom of the locker. The combat boots were there, exactly where she'd left them. 20 years old. The leather cracked at the seams. The left one still had sand in the treads, actual Tikrit sand. She'd never cleaned them, couldn't bear to wash away the geography of the place she was ordered to forget. She pulled them out and stared at them like an artifact from a museum of her own erasure. She'd kept them because some part of her, the part that had learned to survive in places where mercy didn't exist, knew she might need to remember. The drive home took 42 minutes. The Houston skyline glowed behind her in the rearview mirror as she crossed the bridge, watching St. Michael's disappear like a ship sinking into fog. Her daughter was at school for 3 more hours. Brooke pulled into the driveway of the small house she'd rented on Bellaria Boulevard under another borrowed name and sat in the car with the engine off, watching rain begin to fall. The rain came hard, the kind that turned the streets into rivers and made the sky go grey as concrete. She moved inside, made coffee she wouldn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table at 1,406 hours, 2 in the afternoon, middle of a Tuesday, the sun already surrendering to the storm. The kitchen was clean. She'd kept everything in a state of readiness, the way operators do, the way you live when you might have to vanish in 48 hours. She put her head down on her folded arms and let the walls come down. Not a collapse. Not hysteria. Just stillness. The kind of broken that happens when you realize that everything you've built over 18 years of careful, measured breaths is about to detonate, and there's nothing left to say except the truth, and the truth will destroy your daughter. The rain hammered the windows like accusations. She reached into the duffel bag at her feet and pulled out the boots. Turned them over in her hands. The leather was so old it felt like skin. She could see his face in her mind, the 6-year-old boy in Tikrit, skin burned where the IED had caught him, bleeding into her uniform in the back of that field ambulance, his small hand gripping her wrist so hard his fingernails drew blood. She'd whispered to him in Arabic she wasn't supposed to know. Told him his name was safe. Told him she would never leave him behind. She held the boot like it was made of glass. The front door opened at 1,523 hours. Her daughter's voice came through first, bright and unbreakable. "Mommy? You're home early." Brooke set the boots on the table and sat up. Her eyes were red. Her hands were steady. Everything she'd learned to control, and she couldn't control this, the simplicity of her daughter's confusion, the innocence of the question. The impossibility of the answer. "Hi, baby." Her voice came out like it belonged to someone else. Someone from before. "Come here." Her daughter dropped her backpack and climbed into her lap, small and warm and completely, utterly unable to understand why her mother's hands were shaking now, why there were tears on her face, why everything they had built together was about to collapse into a name that nobody was supposed to remember. "Mommy's just tired today," Brooke whispered into her daughter's hair, knowing it wasn't true. Knowing that in less than 24 hours, investigators would come knocking. Knowing that the life she'd constructed, nurse, single mother, invisible, was disintegrating like ash. The boot sat on the table, watching her with the patience of something that had already survived the impossible. Outside, the rain fell harder. And then, through the storm, she heard it. Distant at first. A sound that didn't belong in residential Houston. The low, rhythmic pulse of helicopter rotors, growing closer. The wind began to shake the windows. The noise built from the distance like thunder made of machine and purpose, and her entire body went rigid. She knew that sound. She'd lived inside that sound for the first 20 years of her life. The sound that meant they were coming. The helicopter rotors grew louder. Not approaching, directly overhead now. The windows rattled. Her daughter's hand found hers on the kitchen table, small and confused. Brooke pulled her close without speaking because there were no words that didn't shatter everything, and then the rotors stopped and there was only the silence of a choice being made by someone other than her. St. Michael's lobby filled with morning light and the smell of antiseptic cut with something sharper, ozone, the kind that comes before a storm. The television mounted above the information desk flickered. A DoD news segment. Archived footage. Declassified, they said. A photograph bloomed across the screen, younger, in desert fatigues, face half obscured by dust and a surgical mask, hand steady on a tourniquet. Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. Missing since Tikrit. The ticker read, Decorated combat medic vanishes after classified operation, Pentagon releases name to public after 20 years. Nurses slowed. Orderlies stopped pushing carts. The screen showed her real name. Her real face. Her real war. Marcus's voice cut through the gathering crowd like a blade finding flesh, raw and certain from somewhere deeper in the building. Valkyrie. That's Valkyrie. His wheelchair rolled through the automatic doors, pushed by two CNAs who looked bewildered. Marcus gripped the wheels with hands that had learned to move again in exactly 6 days. His eyes locked on the screen, then swung toward the hallway where Brooke had just emerged from the stairwell, badge already gone from her scrubs, her hospital ID clipped to nothing. That's my Valkyrie. The room held its breath. An elderly security guard, Vietnam vet, according to his name tag, Morrison, 63 years service, went rigid. His hand moved to his chest in a gesture that wasn't quite a salute but carried its weight. When he spoke, his voice shook like a man hearing an old call sign that meant something had been watching him his entire life. That woman is a Master Chief Petty Officer, Special Forces Medical Detachment. I recognize the uniform. He turned to face Brooke directly. I recognize the bearing. The elevator doors hissed open. Not Whitfield. Someone else. Tall. Pressed uniform so sharp it could have drawn blood. 2 silver stars on the collar. A general. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent 40 years making impossible decisions look inevitable. A classified folder lay flat in her left hand. Her right came up in a salute to Brooke before she even crossed the lobby floor. At ease, Master Chief. The general's voice carried the kind of authority that made the fluorescent light seem to dim. She opened the folder. The room did not breathe. Bronze Star Favela Under Fire, Jolin District, March 2003. She paused. Staff waited. Bronze Star for Medical Intervention Under Sustained Enemy Fire, May 2004. Another pause. The weight of recognition settling like a stone. Silver Star for saving 74 civilians and 3 coalition soldiers in a single operation in Tikrit, classified until today, July 2024. The general looked up from the folder. You were ordered to disappear. You did. Brooke said nothing. Her hand stayed steady. A jaw clench, barely visible, but nothing more. Marcus rolled his wheelchair directly to the center of the lobby. Tears streamed down his face, not from pain but from something older, something that had been waiting in him since he was 6 years old and bleeding, and a woman in sweat-stained desert fatigues had knelt beside him and said, I've got you, and I will never leave you behind. His voice cracked but held. I was that child. In Tikrit. She found me in rubble after an airstrike. Shrapnel through my femoral artery. I should have died in 40 seconds. He gripped the wheelchair wheels harder. But she held the pressure. For 8 minutes. 8 minutes in the heat with mortars falling, and she held pressure and talked to me about home, about a place called Texas where the sky never stopped, and she told me her boots, these boots she wore, had walked on ground that belonged to freedom. Marcus's voice became steel. She left me in a field hospital with those boots beside my cot and a note that said, you have a future. You're going to walk. And then they erased her name. 30 seconds. Perfect silence. The kind that echoes. Then Dr. Whitfield's phone rang. Not his, he wasn't present. But a call had come to his mentor from Johns Hopkins, the man who'd trained him in residency, who'd watched the viral video of Whitfield grinding eggs into linoleum while a nurse knelt to clean them. The video had spread like shrapnel through every medical database, every hospital message board, every corner of a profession that believed in hierarchy but also believed in something older, the code that says you protect the wounded, not humiliate them. The mentor had called the hospital board president. The review was already underway. 6 months later, Brooke walked past a strip mall on the corner of Bellaria and Beltway 8, the kind of place where afternoon heat made the asphalt ripple. A folding table sat under a sun-bleached insurance banner. Dr. Whitfield sat behind it. His name tag read, Steve. His hands trembled when anyone asked for a quote. His medical license hung on a wall at the hospital, framed and labeled revoked, 2024. He'd been sentenced to community service, but the real sentence was quieter. He was no longer a doctor. He was a man selling insurance from a folding table while people who knew exactly who he was walked past without stopping. But Marcus rolled his chair to that table. Against all odds, against every neurological prognosis that had said he would never walk again, Marcus was walking now, one hand on the wheelchair armrest, his legs carrying him the way they hadn't in 26 years. He moved like someone who'd been promised a future and spent 6 months proving that promises kept in deserts don't expire. He stopped directly in front of Whitfield. "I'm the 6-year-old, Marcus said quietly. "The one she saved. The one you threw her out of the hospital for trying to save me the way she promised she would." Marcus's voice didn't shake. It was steady as a heartbeat. "Her name is Brooke Sullivan. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer. She carried me out of Tikrit. She carried you too, Dr. Whitfield. She carried everyone." Marcus leaned forward. "You just never understood who you were standing next to." Whitfield's face drained. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Marcus turned his chair and followed Brooke down the sidewalk toward the afternoon sun, two people who'd found each other in a war that nobody knew about and kept their promise to each other across 20 years of silence, across hospital corridors, across the distance between who you are and who you're allowed to be. What viewers should understand is this: Brooke Sullivan could have stayed hidden. The military had ordered her to disappear and she had obeyed because that's what soldiers do. But the moment a paralyzed veteran arrived at her hospital, the moment she saw his eyes and recognized that 6-year-old child's fear, she chose being seen over being safe. The world has countless people who claim heroism from podiums and platforms. But the real ones, the ones who've walked through fire and carried children and held pressure for 8 minutes while the world exploded around them, those heroes wear scrubs and carry secrets and love fiercely because they know exactly how fragile everything is. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was every second she didn't break under humiliation, didn't scream under pressure, didn't reveal herself until the military itself decided the world needed to know. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If this story moved you, if you believe in showing up for the people everyone else has given up on, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength? Because the world needs more Brookes. More people willing to kneel down beside the broken and whisper, "I've got you." More people who understand that the greatest strength isn't in the rank or the title, it's in never, ever leaving someone behind.